Hey guys, welcome to TGS with me, Jonny. I hope you're all safe and well. Welcome to a video on xenophobic gun buying, or choosing the gun you buy by the country it is built in. Once upon a time, British was best, and London was the best of the best. And it was in Britain that this first mild xenophobia built. A London gun was vastly superior to a Birmingham gun, and if you owned one, you would say most Birmingham guns are crap. And then, once Birmingham guns became more acceptable, it was a case of provincial guns are crap. So, someone who owned a Holland would probably snob on someone who owned a Wesley Richards. And someone who owned a Wesley Richards would probably therefore snob on someone who owned a Paxton. All of which, ironically, make amazing guns, probably of equalish quality, maybe not equalish finish. But this was the beginnings, wasn't it? Before that, ironically, there was a time when actually people went to different countries and bought different components based upon the quality of that country's components. So for example, I've got Spanish barrels. So there was a time before everything British being the best, that everything component-wise was being the best. So you could snob on each individual type of gun part, or be xenophobic towards each individual gun part, which is quite ironic. The first country up for ridicule was Belgium. So, once all of the provincial guns were starting to get a little bit more expensive, usually, as I said, forged on Birmingham actions anyway, they had to either cut their costs or provide a opportunity for people to buy cheaper guns. And the person or country that provided that first opportunity to buy cheap guns was Belgium. Belgium, or the Principality of Liège, has been making guns for years and years and years. In fact, in 1907, they had something like 195 individual gun-making companies, 70-odd gun part-making companies, and 13 stock-making companies, or manufacturers. So they're not new to making gun parts and guns. Not by any means. And in fact, have been making them for many hundreds of years. However, and herein lies the issue, is when we tend to go to a new country to import guns, it is always to import the cheapest of the cheap to undercut the market leaders at the time. Aside from the fact that this is the country that spawned such great gun makers as FN Herstal, you know, one of the biggest gun makers now and one of the biggest gun makers then of military arms, they were the first target of our geographic snobbery. And this is because we imported these cheap guns, as I said, and they're still rife today. You can go pick them up at auction, a box lock for a fiver, a side lock for 40 quid that says Belgian or foreign marked on top. And for a quick check of proof stamps, you will soon see that it is fairly cheap Belgian rubbish. These guns are not finished to any perfection. They have not got any types on them. They are thrown together for the price for the market. And as such, they weren't as good as some of the guns that we were finishing here. And as such, people didn't like them. Unsurprising, isn't it? Another one of the guns you'll see from Belgium very, very commonly is the single and double barrel hammer action 410s that everybody buys for not very much money, and most people learn to shoot on. Super lightweight, not particularly well constructed, but we're all familiar with them, aren't we? So they did do a good job in terms of filling a hole in everybody's life as the cheap gun for the time. However, 2 world wars and, you know, the fact that they were certainly producing only better guns for the sort of money and the market meant that we had to look elsewhere. And that next elsewhere for gun xenophobia was Spain. And I say that Belgium was not forgotten, but as their quality increased and people's demand for the quality of guns they were buying from these same makers actually increased, they had to fulfill that quality came at a price, and like I said, 2 world wars took its toll on the gun-making areas of Belgium. So we looked elsewhere, and that elsewhere was Spain. Spain, which was currently under a Francisco Franco-run regime, dictatorship, was pretty bad in depression, to be honest, back in the late 50s and 60s. And as such, any business was good business. And if we went to them and asked them to produce cheap and pretty unexotic firearms to fill a price point, they were going to oblige, and oblige they did. There was lots of labour, and labour was cheap, so they could really mass produce whatever you want. There's a lot of great names out there, there's a lot of less great names out there from Spain, and most of them, yeah, made guns for us back then. Like with everything, and I should say, this is not a case for today. Nowadays, those companies that used to produce thousands of guns made by thousands of men being paid very little money are now made by amazing artisans and very small teams and the world changes, right? With labour basically free, actually these guys were producing slightly better quality, and don't bear in mind we're now sort of 40 or 50 years on from the Belgian guns starting coming in. The quality of machining and the quality of materials has only got better over time. And these guys responded. Cheap labour, good quality-ish materials, but cheaply put together. This didn't last forever though, because as with all things, the market changed. And as much as Spain filled that hole in the market, and you'll see guns just marked Spanish or just single importer names put on guns of varying qualities, things changed. Firstly, their depression didn't last. So suddenly actually labourers wanted to get paid more, and as such guns costed more. They could produce less because they could only afford fewer staff, and as such the quality had to be higher, so the margin for profit was higher. That mixed with the fact that over and unders were just coming into fashion, well, that's what kind of ceased Spanish gun racism. They had to make better guns. A bit like Belgium was currently, was focusing on their better quality guns, most military arms, as well as the FN Browning relationship was blossoming at that time. Over and unders were coming into the market in force, and Spain did not respond to that particularly well, although they did. But there was another country that responded to that over and under call significantly better than anyone else, and that country was Japan. And I think a mixture perhaps of the hatred of over and unders, or the lack of acceptance of over and unders, as well as the fact that it was a new country. People were sceptical of Japanese guns when they first came out. And I, of course, am a little bit of a Japanese gun fanboy, so you'll have to excuse me waxing lyrical about this next bit. And perhaps I should have defended the other countries equally so, but there will be someone in the comment section who does, so don't worry about that. So Japanese guns. The Japan gun trade has been going for many hundreds of years, and really has gone from strength to strength. They've designed and made some brilliant guns, however, and have been making guns pretty much ever since, apart from a small blip after World War II where they weren't allowed, in particular. They've been making some amazing sporting rifles, military rifles and guns. And this was no particular difference when it came to the over and unders we started importing into this country. Looked down on many because of the country of their origin, and because they were cheap at the time, certainly. For example, such companies as Maruku actually, ironically, copied the FN Browning, the Browning Superpose action in part when they first came out, but produced quality built, very well highly engineered, great guns. And that is why particularly someone like Maruku actually went into a business partnership with Browning, because they saw that they could produce guns in Japan. This is a bit later on, not much later on to be fair, after their inception, for significantly less money to the same quality, if not higher, than in their Belgium factory. But it wasn't just Maruku who were about, it was other companies such as SKB, the really dirt cheap guns, KFC, Kochi Firearms Manufacturing Company, all of these companies. Someone like Nikko. I mean, a Nikko Shadow Indy now, people look back and that's pretty much the vision of perfection. A Nikko Shadow Indy Sporter is an amazing gun. There's a huge fan base and a huge collectability value to them, because they got it pretty right. However, at the time, people didn't agree particularly. And that was only because it was a new country producing cheaper firearms, undercutting their old favourite names, and that happens all of the time and continues up until this day. Anyway, Japanese guns got what they deserved in terms of a quality reputation relatively quickly by comparison to the others. This is because even the cheap guns they were bringing in were of superlative quality, in my humble opinion. Although there are a couple you'll see out there that are slightly less so, most of them actually are pretty good by comparison to, and given in time now, we're now 70 years on from the original Belgian guns coming in, things have moved a huge way in terms of machining, engineering and material quality. But those Belgian guns had to fight for a lot longer, those Spanish guns had to fight for longer, and then these Japanese guns had to fight longer than the next people coming in. And the next people to come in and fill that cheap over and under market, given that the Japanese had really set in stone a quality standard, was the Italians. There was indeed a point that Italians imported cheap, crappy guns into this country, although it's kind of hard to think now, and that was only 35, 40 years ago. Whereas the Japanese were bringing them back into the late 60s and early 70s, and that's when that sort of first bit hit home and people didn't like it. These guns in the 80s were not great. There's long forgotten Italian makers out there who luckily are long forgotten, who were producing guns that were pretty much made out of butter. But the price point was so appealing that people could not resist. And as such, when everybody buys a cheap gun and finds out that, oh my goodness, I'm not getting the same quality as I was getting for more money for less money, people said, Italian guns are crap. But this was all changed, actually, by one company in particular, although I'm sure there was other fanboys out there of other companies that will say it was their fault. If their fault, they're doing. And this was Pietro Beretta, the Great Beretta Company. Although they've been making guns for a very long time, and the quality of their SOs was well known. It was in fact the 686s of the 80s that people could buy for, at the time, like 400 quid, that essentially got Italian gun making its name that we go off today. There was a lot of crap out there, and these guys were producing a reasonably priced, entry enough level gun that would last you a lifetime. So actually, by comparison to even the Japanese acceptance rate, the acceptance rate of Italian guns was through the roof. Through the roof in terms of speed and time. It only took 4 or 5 years for people to go, actually, you know what, these guns are amazing. That and the fact that markets were changing ever and ever quicker, and people could respond a lot quicker to the marketing. So, for example, Beretta, just after the 686, brought out stuff like the 682, which was market leading, absolutely market leading, and didn't wipe other people out, but was an amazing value for money gun at the time. And I still think it is, kind of, but it's less so, right? So that brings us pretty much up until the present day of geographical hatred towards guns. And who do we hate today? And pretty much for the last 10 years? Well, the answer is obviously who is currently filling our shelves with cheap and accessible guns that perhaps aren't the best quality because they are cheap and accessible. That answer is obviously Turkey. Throughout this present millennium, we've been sourcing our cheap guns from Turkey because, well, Italian guns have gone up in price and quality accordingly. And, well, there is a few more reasonably priced makers from there, but they're still not as cheap as we can get them from anywhere else. And our hunger for cheap guns, well, it's been pretty much unabated for the last couple of 100 years, clearly, has led us to Turkey, a country that is currently pumping out alloy action over and unders faster than you can shake a stick and cheap semi-autos at a similar sort of rate. Are they any good? Well, yeah, on the same line as everything else is the cheap guns are just getting better and better because manufacturing is getting cheaper and engineering tolerances are getting better for less money and materials are getting better at the bottom of the pile. So if you pick something off the bottom pile now, it is actually a significantly better metal quality, having worked on some of those older, less good guns, than they were for comparatively the same price point on the market versus the living wage. Anyway, Turkey itself has a grand history of gun making that most people wipe aside based on the last 20 years of importing cheap crap guns to the UK. And I say cheap crap guns, just cheap guns to the UK. Some are crap, some are better. That's for sure. So I think the best way with buying any of these cheaper end guns is to see which ones have been around the longest and which ones offer the best warranty, and kind of stay with perhaps those are the best ones. But it has to be a mixture of those who are the longest and those who have the warranty, because a great warranty doesn't count for shit if that company goes bust and disappears overnight. Anyway, Turkey has a great history of gun making, from the back in the day with these huge Dardanelle gun cannons that they're just obscene, lasting many hundreds of years for the quality, all the way through to Turkish Mausers. And there was a point, I am told and assured by a friend of mine, that they were the largest gun making country in the world. The largest gun making country in the world. That's quite some statement. And they were producing guns that were of some quality. I should apologise now for having spoken so fast throughout this entire film, but there's so much information to get out of my head. I think some of you may sympathise. And if you have any questions about what I've said, or if I've missed anything out, chuck it in the comment section below so I'll slow down a little bit. However, they are being judged upon their current cheap rubbish. It's amazing though, in the last few years there's been a few Turkish manufacturers and importers in the UK who are slightly braver and are slowly bringing in this slightly better stuff. For example, something like the Yildiz Pro Sport, which I think is actually a very well produced gun, made of great quality components, handles well, feels well, and is spec'd very, very nicely. All for a very reasonable price. Of course, the gun racists will say that this is not the case and that all Turkish guns are particularly rubbish, and they'll turn their noses up and go, ooh, it's Turkish. But I put money that in 20 years people will go, yeah, Turkish guns are pretty good. Turkish guns are pretty good. A bit like we do now. Nobody knocked a Belgian Browning, or any Belgian gun to be fair. Most Belgian gun makers are top of the pile. Same with most Spanish makers. They are now both most top of the pile and revered by many, although they are still very reasonably priced by comparison to what you would have to pay for an English gun, which are now extremely top of the pile. Japanese guns, similar sort of thing. A lot of the smaller, cheaper companies closed down, which is kind of heartbreaking because there were some amazing guns brought in from over there back in the 70s and 80s that just don't exist anymore. But they do exist on the second-hand market, luckily, because some of them are as close as to perfection as one could hope. Same with Italian guns. Nobody knocks Italian guns now. It's also worth stating that you cannot judge a country now even by its gun-making status, because if you took, Italy, for example, there is still makers that produce cheaper stuff, and there's makers that produce brilliant stuff. So just generalizing a geographic location on its gun-making ability is ridiculous. But anyway, back to the point at hand. Who is next? My bets would probably be on someone like China. Seems like the next logical place to go for cheap engineering and manufacturing once Turkey, eventually, their economy will rise, same as everyone else, and we'll have to look for the next country with the lowest wage packet that can produce the guns that we require for the cheapest amount of money. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Will we see Chinese guns on the shelf in 15 years' time? And will Turkish guns be just as accepted as a Beretta or something else? Even though at that point, if the scale keeps rising, the Beretta's quality will be even higher, but the price for it will be even higher. And we'll be going, oh, I wouldn't pay that for this, bit like we do now with the Silver Pigeon. Given their 1,600 odd pounds, people go, oh, I wouldn't pay that for that. I remember when they were £1,000. I remember when they were £1,000. But everything increases, everything changes. Isn't it just fascinating? I'd love to know if you've experienced any of this, or if you have any comments or statements on it, because actually, to me, this is properly fascinating stuff, and I never really get it, although I must admit I have been party in my life to a mild bit of gun xenophobia, xenophobic gun buying, or xenophobic gun selling, even, at some points in my life. To say I wouldn't buy that is from there, which is awful, actually, when you think about it. But the beauty of growing up is that you get to start owning your mistakes of the past, and you're allowed to change and be more holistic and more rounded in your opinion, because if you don't, well, what a waste of life. Guys, take care, stay safe, stay indoors if you like, just take it easy, and I hope you and your families are all well. Be excellent to one another, because we definitely need that at the moment in a world that is quite negative. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.